Hello, everyone. My name's TJ Schwartz. I'm here with my co host, Lucas Burnley. You are listening to Edge and Flow podcast. So, today we had an exciting kind of topic that kind of was brought to the surface, and we'd love for you to come along with the conversation. And we wanted to just discuss why the knife industry, why knives, why are we makers, what are we doing here? So, I guess I'll take that broad question and I'll point it at you, Luke, to start this out.
Sure. Man, that's a really loaded question. So I've been in the knife industry for about 20 years at this point. Next year is my official 20th year. The knife industry, I don't know if when I first started, I thought about like it as a as an entity, right? I wanted to make things. I had gone through trade school. I worked in trades for a little while. I was a welder. Um, Aspects of that really clicked with me, but the small metals were where my interest kind of fell, right? Like the detail, super detail oriented. It's functional. It ties in with design. Like there's so much around knives. I think that make them interesting as a business, right? There's no glass ceiling, right?
Right.
There's always something, a technique, a material, a genre, an era. There's always something to explore.
Yeah, one thing I get from that answer is the knife industry is huge, right? Bigger than I'll speak for myself, bigger than I thought by a huge margin. So like when I first came
Absolutely.
in, it kind of shocked me. It like I wouldn't say I was overwhelmed, but I was kind of like dumbstruck by the scale of the industry and the vastness and the complexity and the just diversity of the industry. And it's I relive that thought process of when I first came in when I explain to other people what it is that I do, because I tell people I'm a knife designer, and that's what I've used to say mostly, and now I start to say I'm a knife maker, as it's a more recent trend for me to be doing that. But people say, "You design knives full time? You're in the knife industry full time?" And people say, "How is it such a small niche can support a full-time career?"
Yeah.
And then when they say that, I'm like, "Oh, you have no idea. Like, you have no idea how many careers are in existence today that are in the knife industry, you know?"
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, when you think about industry, like we are a smaller industry,
Mhm.
it doesn't feel that way if you're involved in it.
Oh,
It's
exactly.
as big as it needs to be.
And one thing I explain to people when they have that kind of dumbstruck look, when they're like, "Whoa, like, you're a full-time knife guy? Like, how's that work?" And I explain, "Okay, so think of all the things that you own and what you own multiples of. And for example, you own, if you're a sneaker guy, you might own a lot of shoes, but the average person, 3 to 5 pairs of shoes or whatever. And what else do you own that many or more of other than, let's say, shoes to start with?" And they think, "Oh, I don't know, like not very many things, maybe watches, maybe a few articles of clothing." And I say, "How many knives do you own?" And then you think and you say, "Well, my dad gave me one. I did buy one, and then I have like, oh, there's kitchen knives. Do those count?" And then you think, "Well, I have one in my backpack that I don't really use." And then pretty soon you're like, "I might own more knives than anything else." And I say, would you consider yourself a knife connoisseur or a knife nerd?" And they say, "No, not at all. I don't know anything about them." It's like, yet it's one of the most plentiful items in your house. And then you think about that and say, that's everyone. So
Absolutely.
how many
Yeah. And
knives are out
now
there?
you take that to the nth degree
Yeah.
and you put a collector in there,
Yep.
you know? Well, it's interesting too, because you and I came to the knife industry from like very different places, and there's about a decade between us. Right.
Right.
So
Mhm.
how did you really get started in knives at all, coming in from a design standpoint?
Yeah, so I in high school was like obsessed with cars. I don't remember when that bug bit me. It might have been middle school, but I was just inexplicably obsessed with the automobile, right? And from a young age, I was like, I want to design cars. I want to design and work in the auto industry. Like I was like, oh, what a Ford Motor Company. Like, what if I worked for them? It would be amazing. And so I was like, well, and I had kind of a affinity for mathematics and like engineering type things. And so I thought, well, obviously I'll go be a mechanical engineer. And so I enrolled to be a mechanical engineer in school when I graduated. And that was at Boise State University in Boise. And I had also an affinity for like pencil artwork, so drawing. I was like, I would draw a lot of cars. I mean, like a lot. I mean, I would spend hours a day in college, and in the late years of high school, and I had like a small business I called Carbon Handprint Designs, and it was a play on words because like carbon footprint, carbon handprint, because like
Interesting.
pencil lead is carbon, So I was like a little pun there, I guess you could say. And so I had like a Facebook page, like Carbon Handprint Designs, and I would actually go to like a vintage car show, like a muscle car show, and I would have a portfolio, and I would try to get car owners to pay me to draw their car in like a setting that they wanted. And I didn't do a whole lot of that because most of what I did was like my ambition. It was like something I wanted to draw, but I was doing that and selling those drawings and on this Facebook page. And I would literally message like, there's Facebook pages called like Mustang, and it wasn't actually like a Ford page. It was just like a fan page, and it would be like Mustang Hot Rods page on Facebook. And you got to remember, this was in the early days of Facebook, so it was like kind of contrived. It was old Facebook, but I would say like, if I pay you $50, will you share this drawing that I did of a Mustang, of a '69 Mustang? And I would pay them, and they would share it, and then I like loved seeing like the car people's feedback on the drawing. And then I would like sell a drawing, and I would turn that money, and I would pay someone else on Facebook to share another drawing. And I had like
Oh man.
$0 in college, and I was just like paying Facebook pages to
It's just a
share it.
pyramid scheme that you created
Yeah,
for yourself.
to share drawings, yeah. And there was times where I was like, man, I would love to. This is what I want to do. Like, I love doing this, but it's like I can't really monetize this. Like, I couldn't think of a way to monetize like drawing cars, so I kind of stayed the path. But what really occurred to me is like, man, the auto industry is very Goliath and very bureaucratic and very like, it's very regimented and stuff. And I thought like, well, the entry level car designer, quote unquote, would be like, you're drafting something that is a component of a light switch or a headlight or a tail light, something that is really minute and kind of irrelevant to like the scale of the overall design. And the number of people that actually design cars is like astonishingly few.
And you're not getting a lot of times you're not getting credit for it because
Yeah. And
you're
no,
just one cog in the machine.
there's like Chip Foose and like a couple other names out there, but really there's nothing. And so I started to think like, man, that's not going to fit me. Like, that's going to be a problem because I'm not going to feel like I have a creative outlet if I'm in that environment. And around that time, I had a friend I went to high school with him, and his name's Bill Koenig Knives, if you're familiar with them. But this was in those days, he was looking to start Koenig Knives. It was a new company, and he messaged me, and like I said, we'd gone to high school together. So he asked me, he's like, hey man, um, can you draw me a knife? Because he'd seen that I was drawing cars all the time. And in engineering school, I was taking a SolidWorks course, and so this is where the flashpoint happened. I was like, well, let me 3D model the knife because I want to do that. It'd be kind of fun. So like the
What
first
year
thing,
was this?
2013.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so 2012, 2013, probably 13. And so so I modeled a knife for him, started that. And then through exposure, through him to the knife industry, and I started going to blade shows real early on, I realized what we had just talked about the scale of the industry. And it's just struck me like a lightning rod of like, oh my gosh, I can design a knife, like design a fully functioning knife from the beginning to the end, and get it into the market, into people's hands, and not feel like this small cog in like a big mechanism. And I was like, oh, that's what I want, right? And so I
Yeah, the
immediately
number of
pivoted.
floors to the top is different,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
Like you can walk around Blade Show and you can routinely interact with the owner or the founder of a knife company,
Hmm. Yeah.
and you can meet on common ground. Like there's a lot of industries where you can't do that. There's such a huge
Oh,
separation,
100%. And SHOT
right?
Show, I went to SHOT Show around that time. So meeting the executives of different knife companies at SHOT Show, seeing the knife industry, seeing where I was at the end of my sophomore year of college. I dropped out and just went full time knife stuff. So
What year was that?
that was that would have been spring of 14 would have been my last semester.
When did you and I first meet? Was that around 14?
Could have been a year later, but it
Maybe
would have. I
2015.
actually don't remember. Do you remember the first time we met? I don't know if I
Mm-mm.
remember that moment or what that was.
Mm-mm. It was either at Blade Show. Yeah, probably at Blade Show, which again is like a great example
Mhm.
of kind of the scale of the industry. You can go to the industry's largest trade show and still end up making like really meaningful small scale connections, but
Right.
also be completely, you know, accessible to the top.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
crazy.
It is amazing. So tell me more, like, you kinda brushed through how, like I think you told me you were in the Job Corps, is that correct?
Yeah.
And
So I left home when I was like 16. I went to Job Corps and I went through their welding program.
mhm,
And after that welding program, I basically enrolled at a community college, which was Central New Mexico Community College. Um, and I was in the machining program.
mhm,
As I was working through that machining program, I got like a school to work, I got like I forget what, like an internship almost at a small machine shop that did body piercing jewelry.
mhm.
So that was the first time I'd ever worked around like reactive metals like titanium or niobium, and kind of getting to see like CNC machining and just different finishing techniques. A lot of that kind of started there. And it's funny, as you were talking about the drawing thing, I realized like I had a very small business before any of this. So when I was in Job Corps, I would like hang out in my room after school and I would make sterling silver chainmail, like
Wow.
little bracelets and stuff. And I had like a little jewelry case and I would go around to like shops in Albuquerque and I would sell jewelry.
That's amazing.
Totally makes sense. Like you come at it from like a very design oriented process and I came at it from a product process.
That's
But
cool.
I completely forgot about that.
Mhm.
So yeah, just like in course of like working in that machine shop, like I made a knife with one of the machinists that was there, and then it just kind of like snowballed.
So do you remember the moment that you knew that you were a lifer? Or at least the era?
Yeah, I mean, it would have been probably around like 2002, 2001. Like somebody told me you can't make a living making knives. And I remember that being like, remember feeling like this challenge of like, no, you can't.
Right.
Um, and I'm like cursed with like looking very far into the future. I actually think it's like an anxiety thing where I try to plan for all eventualities. But if I'm going to do something, I'm like planning it for 10 years from now. So I just started in the knife industry, like making knives, but I always had this thing of like, okay, when I get here, when I get to this point, like when I get to work with this company, like way before I had any reason to have like any of those thoughts.
Right.
Yeah. And I think it just kind of like snowballed and ended up where we are now.
Right. Right, so it's almost you felt challenged to prove a little
Yeah,
bit?
maybe like initially. And that's like
Mhm,
probably an age thing too. Like I came in
mhm.
when I was 19. So like when you're 19, everything's a challenge,
Oh, yeah,
you know,
for
like
sure. Well,
even like reality.
yeah, and that was the same age that I was doing the same thing, so I can relate 100%.
Yeah, it's an interesting process. Like the industry's changed a lot in the time that I've been in it. And I mean, really in the time that you've been in it too. Like it's an exponential kind of growth in the last decade,
No doubt.
right?
I remember when I first came in, the thicker the blade, the better.
Oh yeah.
I
That was
was
like
in that
full
I
tack.
in that era where it was like, "Oh my gosh, did you see this X and Y knife? It's got a 3/8 inch blade that's only 3.5 inches long." You know what I mean?
I
And
still love it too.
that as a main center focus of like where design was going has
Yeah.
changed. You know?
Oh, fully. Well, I think it moved more into folders, like just again exponentially, but it's also visual cues for design. Like coming out of that point, like we were involved in wars for quite a while. I think a lot of the visuals were this like really heavy tactical, like aggressive, robust look. Um, And yeah, I think that's changed a little
So
bit.
I've read on your website, you have like a mini bio and you
Hmm.
mentioned that your design language you consider to be post-tactical.
Yeah.
Is that in line with what you're saying?
Yeah, I would say that overall, like the style that brought me into knives was like the tactical market. They were very, very utilitarian. A lot of them were either like from some like offensive or defensive, like hand to hand combat, like thought process, like you see, like the Emersons, and like the Striders, like just tough and rugged, super functional, simple, stripped down. Um, and I realized like for my own work, like as I refined and the finishes changed and the materials changed, they still kind of fell into this tactical market, but to me, it didn't feel like a genuine explanation of like what that was. And so
Mhm.
I just started calling them post tactical because I saw that the origins were fully in the tactical era of knives, but I felt like it was a design language that was incorporated but not like encompassing.
Oh, I can totally picture that. When I heard that or read that post-tactical, it really stuck with me because that was years ago when I read that last, but I don't know if it's still on your site, but I remember reading that and thinking, that's absolutely true because you hear about like Bob Trzwola and how he's like the father of the modern tactical folder. And when I first heard him described as that, I was like, is it really tactical? Like, I didn't know that this was tactical. And then you
Right.
look at the lineage and you see where the tactical came from. And then I agree with you that tactical doesn't describe a lot of what we're doing nowadays in the knife industry. So, like, when I read post tactical, I thought, man, that's dead on. It seems
Yeah.
like
And some of these things that we try to explain or put a name on, like I put that name on it for myself so that when I'm
mm,
involved in the design process, I have a way to like categorize what I'm working on or what kind of what my inspiration is at the time. And I have really broad interests in knives, and a lot of what I like isn't even what I make. Like I love like super like brute to forge, like rough, forge to finish knives. I love historical reproductions. Like there's again, it's so broad. Um
so
that it
let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure,
What
sure.
what do you like? Like, what put your design language aside. What
Oh
is
man.
your I'm not gonna say what's the pinnacle of knife design as far as a single knife,
Sure,
but,
but
like
like what does it for me?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, so here in a nutshell, I like big fixed blades that feel fast. So I came at knives from like a very weapons oriented standpoint. Um and so to me like the pinnacle of what like that is, I think is just like, it's a 10-inch bladed fighter um that moves in your hand. Like there's something that is so, I want to say like animalistic or like human. Like you pick it up and you're like you understand it. And you're like, oh, okay, I can like trust my life in this thing.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think that when I say speed, that relates to like proper balance and the flow of design as it relates to the human body.
Like a
So you can have a big, heavy knife, but if it's shaped correctly with the weight in the right places, it's going to feel like an extension of your hand.
right. Like a big cat as opposed to a bull.
Exactly.
Fluid, but
Fluid,
large. Yeah,
fluid, but large.
powerful.
So that's yeah, man. That's what really really does it. Just as like an example of a specific knife, I would say that the knives that Jason Knight makes squarely fall into that category on like a regular basis. Like if you see him walking around at Blade Show with some big kukri or big Bowie or fighter and you pick that thing up, it almost doesn't make sense of like how light and fast
How
and
low
effective
drag.
it
Yeah.
feels. Yeah,
I haven't
it's
held one.
everything it needs to
Now
be.
now I need to hold one.
Yeah, we'll have to go try to find him and see. He's usually walking around with something.
Okay.
So,
I'll look
what
forward to
about
that.
you? What's the Goldilocks?
I'm an outdoorsman. like that's I grew up in a microscopic town part of the country in Idaho, little tiny town, and but really, really just dense, just wilderness all around it. And so I was really spoiled growing up, and I've learned that that was more unique than I thought at the time as far as what that lifestyle was like. But when I picture a knife, I picture being outdoors, hunting, fishing, and when I say hunting, I guess I've never designed a knife that I consider to be like a game processing knife. You know, it's more of like when you're outdoors, like I think of something that can ultimately, first things first, how well does it cut? So like the geometry and the shape of it, as far as like when I look at some designs, I think, well, it's beautiful and all that, but can it cut? You know, and so it's not stabbing that I think about.
Right.
It's not like you know, lateral stress forces. I'm thinking like how well can it cut? How well can and also be strong enough to use on like kindling. And so
Right.
when I think about it, I think what would I carry when I'm backpacking? Almost always is what I like kind of turn back to when I think about like not only what am I going to design, but like what am I going to buy or carry or what do I envision myself carrying? If I can't picture myself backpacking with it, in other words, it's light enough but also bold enough and useful enough. If I can't picture it in a backpacking trip, I tend to lean away from it, if that makes sense.
It perfect sense. It's funny. It's like, yeah, you hear hunting knife, and I think it means different things to different people. So it's like hunting can encompass a bird and trout. It can encompass like a Green River Skinner. They're very different from a design and usability function standpoint, right?
Totally.
A lot of it, I think, it comes down to experience enhancement. It's that idea of like, oh, you're like out walking in the woods, like you're out stalking or you're out scouting or whatever it is, and your knife is something that is with you that like you're able to use.
Yeah, and
It's
it's a
just a piece of
confidence thing
kit.
too.
Totally.
It's a confidence builder to have a tool that you trust. And that also circles back to a little philosophy that I have is that like form is second to function, but both should exist in a well-refined product. So in other
A
words,
hundred
like
percent.
form is not the most important thing, but you can't ignore human psychology when you're designing because you are more likely, this is like proven in scientific studies, that you're more likely to trust something that you are aesthetically pleased by. It's just like a natural part of being a human.
Right.
And so if you trust and rely on something that you visually are appealed to, you
Right.
know, and so like that is something that can't be ignored. And it's easy to get into the mindset of, well, it should do its job, and if and that is all that matters, and it will look the way it looks.
Right.
I'm not that way, but at the same time, if the visual effect that you're going for interferes with the functionality, then you got a problem. You know what I
Totally.
mean?
Yeah, that starts to like border on like the fantasy side of knife making in a way where you're so tied to a visual cue. But I think the knife industry is a great example of form and function existing in balance, and the idea that like function should not come at the cost of form. Like it's not necessary. Like yeah, you can just like sharpen a piece of steel and like grind a pry tip on it and like it's a bar of steel.
Right.
It still does a job. It doesn't mean that that's doing doing a better job than something with a little more care in the design.
Yeah.
But again, some of it is substantially like, or I guess subjective to aesthetic preference,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
you
And
have you ever messed with any of like Mora knives or like any
yeah,
of the like the
I've got one.
Pugas?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that when you were talking about that idea of like the type of function and the tasks that you have, like for me Mora is like firmly situated in that.
Hmm.
They're also super affordable, which it's like one of those things, like I have a few of them and I just love them because I feel like it does everything it needs to be. They're aesthetically pleasing. Like they use color in their designs. And as a tool, it like, even though it's inexpensive, it feels like very well made to me.
Absolutely. And you touched on color. So one of the things in my relationship with CRKT as a designer that I've really tried to bring forward is it's something I made up, I guess, but I call it color science. So, in other words, one of the ways that you can aesthetically improve or change a product, especially a knife, without immediately compromising function is color. So like what kind of color, where is the color, how much color, what's the contrast, what's the, how is the palette composed color wise? And I think it's something that is understudied, I guess, in sometimes in the knife industry and in many industries. And it's like I said, if you want to inject life into something, color is one of the ways to do it. And so I've tried to use that across like a broad path of like what I design, you know? And so it's like the knife can be excellent and functional and also, beautiful, but you can put the cherry on top per se, with the right colors. And so it's stuff like that that it may seem peripheral to the design. It could be executed as an afterthought like, well, what color is going to be? I don't know. I like this color. But if you think of it more as like a holistic composition, and it's like all these things going into it, color is such a big part of it, and that's again to the human nature. I mean, color is so important to humans. It can drive emotion, you know what I mean, which is part of what you're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was thinking about Loveless when you were mentioning that, like the idea of like he used red liners a lot of times. And if you put that in a period of time where just the application of a red liner under like olive drab or under stag, like it material wise, it fits with the materials of the time. But color wise, I think it was like it pushed just a little bit past with what a lot of people were comfortable
And there was
with.
a subtlety to it
There's a
as well.
yeah, it's very subtle and it's
Yeah.
well placed. I think he had described it as like a little bit of lipstick on a pretty girl, and
Hmm.
that's like a very loveless feeling phrase, but it makes perfect sense. Where I think now it's super commonplace. Like lots of people, if you're making fixed blades, you're doing liners. Liners come in all different colors.
Hmm.
But I think if we look at color theory from the standpoint of knives, like there's a lot of range that has like yet to be explored. But I
Hmm.
do think now I think it's more commonplace
Hmm.
um, than it
Yeah.
was like, going back to like the early 2000s where it's like black and gray.
Yep. Yeah.
Those are
and
the
and
colors.
I know one thing that I've heard you say many many times, and it's probably just an extension of this conversation, is you talk about textures,
Oh, totally.
and that's a whole nother dimension.
Yeah. Well, in that, like color, texture, form, like as we're looking at a design from like kind of a holistic standpoint, it's almost like form and function. For me, it's interesting because you and I both are making physical products in our own shops, but we're also involved in the design of products that are going to mass production. And there's probably a whole podcast like just talking about the differences in what works on a custom level versus what works in mass production. Um, but when you're designing for production, a lot of times we're going from a place of not having seen the physical product and specking out material, texture, color, kind of all at once. And so,
Hmm.
yeah, I think if you put a little more thought into it, like it creates more flexibility and a better end product.
No, 100%, I agree. And that, to circle back to our original premise of like why the knife industry, what you're describing and what we've just gone over is like the amount of information being condensed into the final product of what a knife is, and the amount of thought that goes into it is immense. But at the same time can be under the scope of one designer.
Right.
Again, what I'd mentioned earlier of like if you're in the car industry or some other industry, like having control over the color, whether it's a metallic paint or a flat paint, whether the taillights are blacked out or not, versus like what's the interior contrast. Like no one man can have that like under his and under his scope of like what he's doing. And I'm sure there is some guy that's doing that, that's kind of
Or
like
like a final
composing.
oversight.
Yeah, like an
Right.
oversight. But I mean, it's rare that there's an industry where there is so much going on that is condensed into the scope of a single designer, and that's amazing. That's something that I love about the industry. and that has formed for me like an addiction, you know?
Yeah, well, I mean, you nailed it, like, just off of a pretty easy topic, like, we're just starting to rabbit hole into specifics of our industry, and that's the beauty of it, like, it's never ending.
That's right.
You know, it when you're like thinking about color. I don't know why I just thought about like Tinker Hatfield and Nike. Like that is that same control of end product where he's like envisioning a sneaker and he's specking out like the materials and the colors, like super satisfying to like be at the end of that and be like, I had my hand on every part of this shoe.
That's right. And I
You know,
imagine the shoe industry, yeah, it has to be similar, right, to the
right?
knife industry in some ways. And another one this is another metaphor that I've used to describe it to, people that try to understand what I do is the music industry is what I've compared it to.
Interesting.
Because in the music industry, you have people that perform live music, and I directly compare that to someone who makes custom knives. And then you have record labels who are the CRKTs, the Kershaws, the design, the companies that farm designs.
Right.
And then you have the musicians that are at the level where they are being farmed to then produce for like the mass public. And those people also can produce live music as well, but it's a different art form than what you would put on a record in some ways. And so there's when people ask like what it's like, I say like, well, producing music, you're trying to reach like a population that's large, like that's the whole goal. And so like dealing with a production label and how is that monetized? How does that work? How do those contracts work? But also the discipline underneath that of like live music and stuff like that that feels different, that looks different, that you might view a different way. And I'm not a musician, so I can't say that I'm speaking from like experience, but just generally as an overview, like it seems
Yeah, seems like a solid
artistically
analogy.
similar.
Well,
And
and then you've got so distributors or knife purveyors being either like venues
yeah,
or a radio station or Spotify
right.
maybe because you have like that distribution level too.
And another thread that brings it together, which I think is important with the knife industry specifically, is the primal nature of it. So, like with knives, it's like the most primal tool probably that's ever existed. I mean, there can't be much that occurred in development before the knife,
Right,
because it's like if you pick up a rock and you smash a turtle open to eat it, it's like
right,
pretty soon, maybe later that week, you're going to try to sharpen the rock. You know what I mean? So
right, or get
it's
another more sharp
right.
rock.
And it's like you got to think they were using a rock to make some tunes around the same time. And
Yeah.
it's like, you know what I mean? So it really kind of expands, and it's kind of wacky to talk about it.
I
I
mean,
don't,
yes and no. But, I mean, design in general, regardless of what like if you go back to cars,
mhm,
right? If you listen to or a motorcycle, if you listen to like a loud rumbling engine, that has to be connecting to some part of your animal brain where you're like big like bear. Like
mhm,
you're projecting like space, you
that's right.
know? I mean, knives at the most basic level gave us teeth and claws
Hmm.
because we are super soft. We're really slow. We have bad eyesight, bad hearing, but with big brains.
Yep. And we have sharp tools.
And we have sharp tools. It's
Yeah.
like,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, you can't really get more base than that.
And so that's where when people talk about like what does the longevity of this career look like moving forward, it's like,
Right.
do you think music's going to go away? Do
Right.
you think people are gonna
Does art
stop
go away?
sharpening things? You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
no. I mean, it's just it's again animalistic. It's fundamental. And that's another thing that I discovered about the industry that I didn't originally really know or think about. But it really is. And that's it brings me back to the point of like when you think about like a gift, if you're not a knife person, like the one of the things you often think about is a knife, you know what I mean? Like a lot of people give
Sure.
different types of knives as gifts, and it's like, why is it that? And it's like, well, what's something that's like one of the lowest risk gifts that everyone can find a use for? It's like it's a knife, you know what I mean? And so it's like it's just such a universal thing. It's just so universal.
they're also involved in ceremony and ritual, which is very cool. Like weddings are a great example. I had a chance to make a cake knife for a cousin recently, and I was like, oh wow, this is like a special occasion tool. It's like not going to be used all the time. It's going to basically be used around joyous events.
That's right. Yeah.
There's so many different ways. Like we just talked about like the animal side of it. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh no, it's also front and center. Like you're cutting the cake at a wedding.
Hmm. Yeah.
Man, it's cool.
Yeah.
We're lucky. It's a
Yeah.
pretty fun industry.
I got lucky, which that opens up another kind of, I don't know, thread to the conversation, is that like I got lucky that I moved to Boise because I didn't know where the knife industry resided. I didn't know what towns and places were like populated with knife people. And
Right.
then come to find out, I was going to Boise State and I'm like, holy cow, there's a hotbed of like knife people here. There's, Chris Reeve,
And
Grant Gavin
legit.
Hawk. And
Yeah.
I'm like, man, that like it's here. Like and I didn't know that was rare. And then I got, I guess it's not rare, but it's it's one of the more populated cities when it comes to like knife related things.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, Portland's one of the places that's huge too, as
Yeah. In the
everybody
United
knows.
States right now, you basically have like Boise and Portland, and then everybody else is like spread out. And like
That's
I don't
right.
know, a lot of industry and manufacturing like you see is back on the East Coast.
Hmm.
So it's interesting that something like knives just kind of resides in a more westerly direction.
Yeah.
Which actually I think it actually kind of makes sense. Some
Hmm.
of it is a space as a function of available space. Like I just think that why are there not more knife companies in New York City? Like maybe that the
Yeah.
proximity of people,
Yeah.
the pastimes, like all of that ties into it.
Yeah. Yeah. No doubt. And firearms are a big East Coast thing, which is amazing. But they are also old, storied companies.
That's
There's not a lot of new firearm companies. There's a lot
yeah,
more
they hit and
new.
stuck.
Yeah.
Like that's industrial revolution. The businesses were built. You're Smith and Wesson. You
Yeah.
stay.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But yeah,
No
that's
doubt.
true. Ruger, Smith and Wesson,
Yeah.
Sig.
Connecticut and
Yeah,
places.
it's like it's
Yeah.
crazy.
Pretty big time. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, finding my roots in Boise and the knife industry, it reminds me of the Malcolm Gladwell, conversation about outliers. It's a book that he wrote, and he talks about how like time and place is so important in like the character arc and the career arc of each person.
You and
And
I
like,
talk about that a lot, actually.
yeah,
Just that unique circumstances colliding,
hmm,
and obviously some of it comes down to just luck of the draw,
hmm,
but also I think it takes something away to not be like, oh, you're moving in a direction already, and then you run into something that is complementary,
that's right.
which I think
Well,
is kind of what happened with you.
and there's some phrases like I don't 100% subscribe to, but I do agree with to an extent. Is like luck is when preparation meets opportunity.
Right.
You know what I mean? So there's some of that. There's some of that,
Right.
but also which industry I ended up in was, I would say, almost completely determined with where I was, because I discovered it was around me very quickly. And if I was in Detroit going to school,
Sure.
maybe the car industry would have been the direction. You know what I mean? So it's like, who knows? But yeah, the time and the place, man, it really, it worked out. And I'm just speaking to your point about like, I feel lucky, because the industry really is where I want to be. And
Yeah.
there's been moments in time in the early days, I spent a lot of years just kind of, bootstrapping it, trying to get into this industry. And I could tell, like there's onlookers that are like, you really working this hard in the knife industry. Like there's outsiders that maybe couldn't picture what it was. But
Right.
I always thought like, man, it is special. And like, I would always think about what other industry could I pivot to that makes sense too. And nothing jumped out at me quite like it does. You know what I mean? Like there was a staying power involved in just seeing what the
It's a
knife industry was.
passion driven industry on the customer side and on the maker creative side. You
That's
know,
right.
that makes it an attractive proposition.
Right. And just the how many people not only have knives but make knives, you know what I mean? Because
Right.
it's really common that I'm talking to people that maybe I barely know, and they're like, "Oh, I've actually made some knives." You know what I mean? Like I've even if it's in the most fundamental way, like I ordered a knife tang and I put, a deer horn on it or whatever.
Sure.
Like there's just so many people that that did answer to that like primal instinct and like at least dabbled in it.
Oh,
And so
yeah. Everybody's got an uncle or a cousin or something. Here's like a weird random connection. I met a neighbor 4 houses down a while back. He's like, "Oh, my wife's cousin's a knife maker." His wife cousin's Gil Hibben.
nice.
Like that is a I mean, he's an industry icon. Just a
Yeah.
random
Yeah, just a connection. Well, one
yeah.
time I was on Reddit and I was scrolling and it was a guy that said, "My grandpa or my uncle, maybe it was, or something like that, makes knives." And I click on it and I'm like, Bill Harsey.
Yeah,
I'm like,
it's
gee.
crazy.
And I was like on Reddit randomly. I'm like, you, and there was like comments like, "Your grandpa's Bill Harsey." Might not have been grandpa, something like that.
Right.
But it was, I just thought that along those same lines of like, yeah, yeah, it's like whoever this was knew that Bill, his uncle or whatever, was important. But then the
Right.
knife industry says like, "Oh man, like why aren't you making knives? Like get into this thing."
We're in a pretty interesting period, I think, of modern knife history, which is a lot of kind of the founding fathers of the modern like renaissance for custom knives are still with us.
Right.
You mentioned Bob Terzuola earlier, like that's generationally like he started a movement in knife making. Like he was one of the first knife makers, I think, to use like Kydex, uh, maybe the first knife maker to use like G10. And you think about what that means now as a modern knife maker, like those guys are still around.
Hmm. Yeah, it's amazing.
That's a super unique period of time.
And I have to contrast it because I look at, so my dad is a craftsman. He makes saddles, Western like horseback riding type. Sheridan style is what they call it. Sheridan, Wyoming is like kind of one of the like focal points of like the leather world, especially Western saddle making. There's a museum there with a bunch of saddles in it, and that's so much different than the knife industry. There's a lot of similarities, but to your point that you just mentioned, like saddles have impressively been very similar for a very, very long time, like very, very long time. And it's different because it's like the huge innovations between like an English saddle and an American saddle happened like, I don't know, early 1800s or something like that. And so it's amazing that, in the knife industry we've seen such change so recently, whereas
Hmm.
in other art forms you haven't seen that as much, not all, but like some like that. And it's interesting to see, and it's cool, like you said, to actually be able to talk to people like that. And I think the pace of movement in the knife industry is also an attractive thing to me. Of just that,
Right.
like this thing's moving. It's a moving target. It creates a challenge with each passing day of like where are we going, and
Yeah. It's hard
it's
to be
fun.
static.
It's fun to do that. It's fun to like to move with it.
In your experience, like with the saddle industry, is it a fairly open industry as far as like transfer of information and like sharing process?
Yeah, I would say so. The thing about saddle making, a saddle maker that is truly a saddle maker is pretty rare in the world of leather work. Saddle
Right.
making is a narrow discipline of that, and so there's really not a lot of saddle makers that are like true saddle makers, and so the community
How do you
isn't.
differentiate? Like
But
when you say not a true saddle maker, what would the next version of a
um,
saddle maker be?
I guess you could make the differentiation that like there's people that have made a saddle. It's kind of like circling back to the knife maker thing that we mentioned earlier. It's like there are people that have made a saddle and maybe they just had their fun and then that was it and moved on.
But
But like
not making a living.
someone who's either making a living or like trying to make a living at it, you know what I mean? Like make like a career type saddle maker, I guess I would say. And there's just not that many. And so my dad is part of an organization, and their whole motto is hold on to the West, and their whole plan is to like broaden the expanse of like people that are interested in that as an art form, and it's very interesting to watch, and it's with you know they call it the Yellowstone effect with like the Yellowstone TV show. It's interesting to see like the little bit of a stir up that's been in that
Right.
industry of like a resurgence of like Western interest. Like by that I mean like the Wild West.
Right. Everything is cyclical. Well, I mean, that
Yeah.
ties into like right now with like, great migrations and people moving from like the West Coast, like inland. So like you're getting a lot of people in Idaho, like we had people move to New Mexico, like just people are moving. And then that style, that design is something new. The lifestyle is something new. And I
Mhm.
think that like drives it too. And then that's, you've got a show that has like widespread popularity and you're like, oh yeah, cool. Like I do want a flannel and a cowboy hat.
Yeah,
That's
right.
pretty neat.
Bozeman, Montana looks pretty
Bose,
cool.
yeah, until you look
Yeah.
at the price tag.
Yeah, I know, right? That's right.
I think where I was going with that was the idea that some of the smaller industries can be pretty closed as far as like sharing of techniques, and the knife industry is the opposite of that.
Mhm.
Um, it makes it feel very community oriented. Like more often than not, if you see a technique or like something you like and you ask the maker, they will help you, if not figure out how to do that exact thing, kind of help you on the way to developing your own similar process.
Mhm.
And that's crazy. Like it is just so, I think overall like a kind open industry, which is makes it fun.
Oh, I agree 100%. And I've spoken with people who have been like people have interviewed me that weren't necessarily knife people that may have been, hired by say CRKT to like do some interview content with me or write a blog post or something. And they've touched on a lot of other industries and they've told me that they see the same thing, like an
Right.
openness and like a just general like community type feel
Yeah.
to the knife industry. And part of it I think is a product of the size of the industry too, because it feels like there's no limit. You know what I mean? Like it feels like there's no shortage of people interested in knives that want to purchase knives. It doesn't feel like you're fighting for the same customer.
There's, yeah, competition like isn't like the game,
Hmm.
right? There's enough, I think there's enough to be able to share. I actually think a lot of the competition exists on the customer side because most of the makers that have some level of demand can come nowhere near reaching their like demand for in terms of output.
Yeah.
So I think on the customer side, it can actually be tricky to be like,
Yeah.
I do want you to get this thing, but like, I'm going to try and get it,
Yeah.
you
No
know?
kidding. And the fact that there is like a perceived vacuum for some of
Right.
this stuff
For
for
some
these
of it.
knives,
Yeah.
I think that that contributes to the lack of like animosity between makers in some
Yeah.
ways. I think that's got to be part of it because if it felt like there was an overwhelming supply and there like wasn't enough people to buy it, maybe things would get a little bit more edgy, you know?
Right. Yeah. It's not a
Um,
scarcity mindset. Like
yeah,
we look at it and we're like, hey, we're all here and we all enjoy our work and these people enjoy our work.
yeah,
Let's all enjoy
yeah,
it together.
yeah. It's very satisfying. I really enjoy it, and like it's been a little bit since I've been to the shows, because I used to hit the Blade Show, Shot Show, like some of these good ones, and the whole COVID thing, and I had two kids in the last since COVID started. I've had two
Right.
kids, which is crazy, but so I kind of got out of the show circuit and now I just talking about it right now. I just get so excited. We're going to Blade Show, and man, I can't wait to get back. Like
I
we're
know.
starting to talk about this community that I like kind of have been distanced from, but it's going to be amazing.
Yeah, I'm very excited. This is the first Blade show that I'll have done without a table. Um,
Hmm.
and I had made the decision, like for me, shows at this point, the value of them is being able to like visit with people in the community. And our like show setup has got the pre-pandemic had gotten like so big and like all encompassing that it just like didn't feel manageable. I also have two small kids. We moved during the pandemic and it's like it's a lot, right? Like
Yeah.
something at some point has to give. So I figure that being able to go to Blade Show and like reconnect with like the show is the value that I see. And I'm just super excited. Like
Yeah.
we're gonna be there the whole show. I'm teaching a blade grinding class.
Oh,
Um, and then I'm just gonna hang out in the pit
yeah.
and we're gonna
Sounds
visit
like
with people.
sounds like a good time. So I
Sounds
got
like
a
a good time.
I got a question for you. So
All right.
we've I think made a pretty dang good sales pitch for being in the knife industry.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. If someone's listening to this and they think this is what I want, what do they do?
Ooh. I'm going to answer, oh man, there's just different ways to go into it, right? So start learning CAD.
I was going to say, if you're listening to this on a device, it's an audio program. That means you can go to fusion360.com or whatever the website is, AutoCAD, whatever it is. Download Fusion 360 as a free trial and start using it rigorously. Step one, do that right now.
Yeah.
Like
And the
it's
reason that I
imperative.
said it was I was thinking, like, what's the barrier to entry? And the barrier, like when I started, I mean, I was trying to figure out how to physically make a knife inside of an apartment.
Hmm.
That is not the best way. Like, yeah, you can do it, but not everybody has the capacity to have a workspace or even the finances to buy tools. And at this point, man, the ability, like you can, like TJ said, you go download Fusion and then you can go to like Titans of CNC and get like free CAD training. Like, we're in a very interesting period of time as far as technology goes. And like,
Hmm.
past just getting a piece of paper and like starting to sketch, I think the CAD thing is so valuable just as a starting
Yeah.
point.
And the first thing, in my opinion, that I would spend money on. So let's say you have a solid or not. Well, SolidWorks is what I started with, but it's pretty pricey, and Fusion 360 is way more accessible. But the second thing, the thing I would spend money on, is get your body to either Blade Show West, or a major knife show in your area. Any knife show. Knife shows to me were an imperative. It was like it was the moment where like dots started to connect for me, and where I started to understand like this economy of knives and things. And I don't
Absolutely.
think you can feel it and see it without going to the shows. Even with social media being what it is and how profound it is
Yeah.
today, you got to go to a show. And so I we had talked about this where like in the early days for me, I was a broke college kid. I dropped out. I didn't get a job. Like I literally went straight into doing this stuff and trying to like bootstrap it from the very beginning, like totally broke. And I had to go to these shows. I knew I had to go. And so it was like I'd buy the ticket and like I would get there's four friends of mine that would drive down from Springfield, and it's Illinois, Springfield, Illinois, right? No, Massachusetts. And so they would drive down and they would get a hotel and I would pay for like 1/5 of the hotel,
Sleep on the
and I
floor.
would sleep on the floor. And I was
Yeah.
like, I did that for like 4 years, dude. And it was like I had to be there. And so that I'm not trying to say that I like has some big sacrifice or something. I'm just saying like you have to find the way to get there because it's so important. It's that important. And all I
I
had was
completely
CAD
agree.
and putting
Yeah.
my face in front of people at shows. That was all I had for most of my career. For like 8 years of my like 10-year career, all I had was CAD and showing my face at shows. And so that's I built the career on that alone. So like if that's all you can do, you have a good
Obviously, it
start.
works.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and again, the show, like you had mentioned, just social media. Social media is a huge tool for our industry. It revolutionized a lot of, I think, just the way knife makers and companies interact with society, writ large. Um, but like you can look at a photo of a knife and understand nothing about the fit and the finish and how it actually is made, where you go to a knife show and it starts to teach you to see. I always
Mhm.
say, like, if I bring someone into the shop, and like I've had employees over the years, the first job that I try to kind of take on is teaching them how to see the knife, like see what matters, see the
Right.
the finishes, the contours. Knife show, like you just get that in a flood.
Totally. And to see people, you know what I mean? To see
Yeah,
like how is it,
and meet
what are their
people.
personalities? Like what are the problems of the average knife maker? What are the
Sure.
successes? Who's succeeding and who's struggling? Like just like the human aspect too, it's like
Right.
just the whole experience is to absorb culture and product in the knife industry, and it's imperative. But is there anything else, like those are two bullet points? Do you have another one?
I mean, as far as like entry into the knife industry,
Yeah, like if you're trying to get the wheels turning, get it going.
no, I mean, really, I guess if I was going to go at it from a maker standpoint, like you really want to make a knife. Um, I started with no power tools. I built a little forge. Like, just start making something. It doesn't matter.
Mhm.
The gap from never having made a knife to making a really horrible knife is like one of the hardest like thresholds to cross. Um, so I mean, you can do it like regardless of space, money. Like Wayne Goddard wrote a book called The $50 Knife Shop, which was awesome. Like the tools in it were terrible, but like you could build a knife.
There's a guy on YouTube. His name's Aaron Goff, Gough. I believe it's
Mm-hmm.
Goff. Aaron Goff. He has some awesome YouTube videos for like the budget builder, like the Home Depot knife maker, but
Totally.
still a high end knife, still like quality. So
Yeah. So I'm very analog in the way that I think. So if books for me are a huge one. Like first knife making book I ever bought was How to Make Knives by Lovelace and Barney. If you get that book and you read that book, you can make a knife. And that's also a great place to start.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
you know?
and just absorbing information. Absorb the ability to absorb information is like a discipline in any field that if you're trying to get started or get involved with something like it's information is power. You know what I mean?
Yeah. YouTube is an insane resource. I don't use it enough. Like when you look any topic you want to learn, like it's a free resource. Someone's filmed it, you
Hmm.
know?
Yeah,
That's pretty cool.
yeah.
Yeah. What
Well,
else, man? What else about the industry?
we've I think we've made the sales pitch as to why to get
Sure.
into the knife industry. We've touched on how. How about this? Who we've talked about the industry as far as like kind of in a macro way.
Sure.
Who got you into this industry? Like who is a person that was like that was
Ooh.
important in the beginning?
So I remember uh there was a instructor at CNM in the machining department. I was trying to remember his name. I can't. Ben. Um, he saw that I like made a knife. Somehow it came up, and he was like, "Oh, there's this knife maker down in Bosque Farms. It's like 20 minutes from Albuquerque." And he was like, "Oh, I've got his phone number," and he gave me his phone number, and that was Joe Cordova, who was he was the first knife maker I met, and he was awesome. He was kind of a like jack of all trades as far as the industry goes. He recently passed away, and the industry definitely lost like a
Hmm.
true original. But yeah, just seeing the way that he worked and kind of like how he worked. I think I never worked with him. I tried to apprentice under him. He never wanted an apprentice, but his door was always open. And just being able to kind of see process, man, it had to have shortened like, I don't know, like 10 years of trial and error,
Hmm.
you know? And then
Yeah,
like second to that, like, or second timeline wise, I had the opportunity to work in Bob Terzwola's shop for a
it's
couple of
amazing.
years. Ridiculous, right? Like I knew what it was when I did it, but now I have like a very different appreciation for it. And that was right when I was starting to make folders. And I mean, I can't even fathom like how valuable that was. And Bob's
No,
a
it's
really good
amazing.
friend. And yeah, what about you? What was
Well, Bill Koenig
Koenig?
is the
Right.
obvious one. I mean, even dating back, so he was really hot on the bussy thing
Oh, interesting.
on blade forms in high school, like big time. Like
Were you on Blade Forums?
not at that time in high school. I am now, but he in high school would buy he like bussy would do a drop, and then people would buy them and then resell them. And so he was like aware of this kind of thing that was happening with the bussy knives and like hey you could resell them, and he would buy those knives. And
Huh.
at like 16 years old, I would go to his house and he would have like 15 bussies, like swords, freaking 20-inch long, like drop point chopper looking, everything like just crazy, and he would resell them, and he sold like thousands of dollars worth of knives like in high school. And he asked me, because my dad had the leather shop, and he asked me, he's like, can you make, because Busty doesn't sell sheaths, they only
Right.
sell knives, and he said, can you make a sheath for a knife like this? And I would make knife sheaths, and either he would help me sell them on blade forums, or I'd sell them on eBay. So that was my first real thing in the knife industry, was like selling some Busty sheaths and that were
Oh,
made in leather.
wow.
But then, so that was the beginning. And then, he did his thing. I went to college. And then a year later, it was like, then we kind of reconvened for the knife thing and the Koenig knives era. And so he was the one that unequivocally, showed me the industry for sure. And then from there, like as it ratcheted up, like Gavin Hawk became a great friend of mine pretty quickly there, because he's probably the first like real legit guy that I like came to know that was a designer. And then it really kind of took a leap when I got to know Ken Onion. So I was in Hawaii on a vacation, just like with my family, spring break. I was still in college, and I was just weirdly, I was like laying in bed in the hotel, and I like was watching YouTube, and I saw a video of Ken Onion, and it's a video of him at Blade Show from like years past. So this was like probably 2010 Blade Show
This is
that was
on TV?
on YouTube.
On
On
YouTube.
my
Okay, I was like,
phone. Yeah.
what? Like,
Yeah, and so I'm looking at it, and he's saying, like, "I'm really interested in kind of, like, cultivating the next generation." Like, he said that, and I was like, "Man, that's a cool guy." Like, that was kind of my first exposure to, like, wow, how open the big shots really are to, like, the young guys. And I was like, "He's in Hawaii, I'm pretty sure." And I looked it up, I'm like, "He's on the same island that I'm on." And so I messaged him on Facebook, and
oh,
I was like,
wow.
"Hey, Ken, probably never heard of me. I'm a knife designer, kind of whatever. Can I any chance at all I could say hi, get to know you a little bit or whatever, just a long shot. I was already there. I had like 3 days left on the vacation, and I'm on the USS Missouri, which is where the World War II armistice with Japan
Uh-huh.
was signed. Like, and I was like 20 feet from where that signature took place. And I get a message from him, and he's like, "Hey, I know exactly who you are." And I was like, "What?" I was like, "Ken Onion knows who I what?" And so
Ken watches.
yeah, and I was like, how does he know?" And I couldn't believe it. And he's like, "Yeah, come up to my place tomorrow." And so I, just couldn't believe it, and went up there and spent like 10 hours at his house, and just hit it off. And the way he'd heard about me is like, cuz I was doing the no tool take apart the Zaneta with, no screws, fully disassemblable without tools. And he was working on the field strip technology, the CRKT stuff, like behind the scenes, like unreleased.
Mm-hmm.
And he saw that there was other people working on it, and so he tells me that he was curious to get to know me, and was considering reaching out to me. And then I message him, and I'm like on his home island, I'm
Perfect
a
timing.
Idaho boy. So it was like seriously one of the most surreal like moments of my just life. And so that was really like the locked in, like I've kind of a flashpoint of like, I feel like this is where I belong. Like, this is
Yeah.
amazing.
I
And
have a
so,
feeling that Ken has probably brought a lot of people
oh yeah,
further into the fold.
he
He's a
is.
great ambassador of our
Oh yeah,
industry.
he is amazing guy. Really, really cool
Yeah.
guy. Just accomplished so much, and like just is so
Just
open.
down to earth and like
Yeah, he's
funny,
funny.
like
Yeah,
approachable.
yeah,
Yeah.
good guy.
We'll have to dig into the Zenaida at some point
Yeah, yeah. That's
because
definitely
that,
a topic for another day. Because that
yeah.
story that I just touched on, like, man, there's so much there. And but yeah, I'm a World War II like buff. Like, I'm obsessed with World War II. And so like I was on the USS Missouri, and like where the armistice was signed, or the treaty or whatever. And like Ken Onion messages me that he knows who I am. I was like, what? You know what I mean?
Best thing ever.
Like, yeah, it was like truly one of the more surreal experiences of my life for sure.
Pretty fun, man. So, I mean, what are we doing? This is a podcast. We're
Hmm.
doing a podcast.
Yeah,
We're gonna do more podcasts,
that's
you
right.
know?
Yeah, podcasts really feel like the future for like content consumption for a lot of people. There's a lot of commuters, a lot of people work from home. I'm like, man, you and I talk on the phone all the time, and I think we have pretty interesting conversations, and I hope you think that. And
Yeah.
I
Might be biased, but
obviously you agreed to be on a podcast with me, but yeah, we had talked about it. I don't know who broached the subject first, but it seemed like what if we recorded, some of these conversations? Like, what if someone wanted to listen to it? So I
Sure. I
hope
mean,
somebody
it
does.
ties in with the industry thing too, and social media, because like for both of us right now, like we're working in our businesses, we're trying to spend time with our families. We have small kids. And I feel like podcasting is a really approachable way for us to be part of the community and to like also just have nice conversations.
Right.
So it's one of those timing things. It just feels
Hmm.
like it's a really good time for us to be able to sit down and like have a cup of coffee and
Yeah.
talk shop.
Well, and the other thing is, I'm one of the people that, like, if I have a 5-minute conversation with someone about something, or if like there's a 5-minute soundbite of me, or of course sometimes less than that, like I always feel like I was just getting started. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
that's I feel like intellectual, just dipping and diving and going all over the place like we have for the last
Right.
hour is fun. And it's like I think some other people think it's fun too, fun to listen to. So it's like,
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it, man. I listen to so much like audio weekly. So it's either audiobooks or podcasts.
mhm,
And I just realized I'm like, man, it's such an enjoyable format, you
mhm.
know?
One
So
one thing we talked about, I hope this happens, is like I want to answer questions, you know what I mean? Like
for
I want to
sure.
know what people that listen to this, if they do, like what do they think? What do they want to know? You know what I mean? Because
Yeah.
I I'm of the same mindset that like a lot of these guys are, like Ken Onion, that's like there's got to be someone listening to this that wants to know how they should, move forward, you know what I mean? Like they might have all the questions in the world, and it's like I want to answer those questions, and I'm,
Yeah,
you
I
know.
feel the exact same way. Like this industry has given me so much, provides for my family. Like it's given me like a sense of satisfaction, and I love to bring new people into it. We're
Mhm.
talking about Blade Show. Assuming this episode is going to air,
Yeah.
before then, like hopefully someone comes up and talks to us at the show because they heard this. Who knows?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
So,
I'm excited, man.
yeah. Yeah, we're gonna have a good time. So
Pretty good.
I hope you guys like it, and I hope you are okay with our wackiness, dorkiness, or whatever you want to call it. But we're not gonna stop if you don't like it. So
It's true. You can
sorry.
just not listen.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Yeah. So anyway, I
Cool.
think we'll jump off.